Thank you very much, and honorable members of parliament and everyone on the web today for this conference. I'm truly pleased to join you all, and particularly Morgana Daniele, the chair of the Commission for Addiction Prevention, for this hearing on decriminalization of drug possession and use. And as you just heard, across the world, a growing number of national authorities are moving away from an only repressive attitude towards drugs and experimenting different ways of managing their presence and their reality in society. And these approaches include harm reduction, for which Lithuania has a long experience, and decriminalization of use and possession for personal use, today's topic. This is a debate that I look forward to very much, a debate about policies based on evidence, not ideology. So thank you very much for your invitation, and I look forward very much to the discussion, Morgana.
Thank you so much, Professor. You should most probably go on now with your presentation. The first part of our conference belongs to you as well.
Thank you very much. So let me start formally by thanking you and the members of parliament for this opportunity to speak and provide you with the perspective of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. Let me first say what the Global Commission on Drug Policy is. It's a commission that was established 10 years ago by a small group of leaders, including Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the former president of Brazil, and Kofi Annan. The first publication of the commission was in 2011, and I believe this was the first time that a group of global leaders stopped talking about drugs in moral terms of good and evil, but instead put forward evidence-based analysis and recommendations. Today, the Commission has 25 members from all continents, leaders from the fields of politics, including 15 former heads of state and government, economy, health, and culture. As commissioners, we advocate for drug policies reforms that are based on scientific evidence, human rights, public health, and security. And I'm actually very pleased that another member of our Global Commission is also with us today, Pavel Bem. We spoke briefly an hour ago because both of us got wrong on the schedule of this conference. Together with Pavel, we are the two physicians on the Commission. So warm greetings to you again, Pavel. For the last 10 years, the Global Commission has been promoting what we call 5 pathways for policies change. First, for drug policy to prioritize the health of individuals and communities. Second, and we put it as a separate but important pathway on health, to ensure access to controlled medicines, including opioid medications for pain and palliative care, to all those who need them across the world. Third, to decriminalize the possession of drugs for personal use, the topic of today's hearing, and I'll come back to that in more detail. Fourth, to redirect law enforcement towards violent crime and money laundering, rather than focusing for law enforcement on people who use drugs and non-violent, low-level actors of drug trade. And finally, to move away from prohibition and move step by step towards state-regulated drug markets, just as we do for alcohol and tobacco. So to maximize the safety of drugs so that people know what they buy, whereas this is not the case on the streets, and also to remove the market from the hands of organized crime, an organized crime that is a direct consequence of the prohibition of drugs. So in summary, we believe that, as Kofi Annan had put it so eloquently, he said, drugs have destroyed many lives, but wrong government policies have destroyed many more. Now, on criminalization, many countries still rely on criminalizing possession of drugs for personal use. But at the same time, if you look at the global picture, more and more countries are now implementing decriminalization policies for the possession of drugs. And furthermore, as I'm sure you know well, a number of states in the United States and countries such as Canada, Uruguay, and others are now legally allowing the recreational use of cannabis, despite the international conventions of 1961 and 1988 that state that, quote, parties will adopt measures as may be necessary to establish as a criminal offense under its law the possession, purchase, or cultivation of narcotic drugs or psychotropic substances for personal consumption. So in this regard, I look very much forward to hearing the perspective from the Czech Republic, Portugal, and Norway this morning. Our commission actually advocates for lifting all sentences, whether criminal or administrative, for the possession of drugs for personal use for people causing no harm to others. And there are several reasons why we believe that, as I said, all sentences should be lifted, and primarily, of course, criminal sentences. One set of reasons, and Morgana mentioned that in her introductory remarks, is that sentencing for simple possession under criminal law has failed having any effect on drug availability, consumption, and use. And to the contrary, it has had harmful negative effects on people who use drugs, communities, and society at large. Criminalizing people who use drugs has fueled a global pandemic of HIV and of hepatitis C. Of the 16 million people who inject drugs globally, 2/3 are currently living with hepatitis C and at least 15% living with HIV, with many also at high risk of contracting tuberculosis and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. In some countries, and particularly in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet space, the rates of people who inject drugs living with HIV and hepatitis C can be as high as 50 and 90%. Criminalizing people who use drugs has also led to a wave of over-incarceration and prison overcrowding. Research here shows just staggering data. Out of the 2 million people incarcerated globally for drug-related offenses, 83% are in jail because of the simple possession or use of an illegal drug. And another 600,000 people, at least, are detained against their own will in drug treatment facilities in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East. In Colombia, only 2% of people incarcerated on drug charges were in intermediary or top positions in drug trafficking organizations. Data from the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Abuse, the MCDDA, shows that of the almost 1.4 million recorded drug offenses in European countries, 82% were just possession and use offenses, with the remainder related to trafficking. And according to a now old, I think, 2014 report by the Eurasian Harm Reduction Network, 43% of people incarcerated for drug offenses in Lithuania and in Latvia were incarcerated for drug possession without intent to supply. Interestingly, last year, during the first wave of COVID-19, authorities in very different parts of the world have released tens of thousands of people incarcerated for nonviolent offenses in order to control the pandemic in prisons. I must say, I don't know whether that was the case in Lithuania, but by doing so, they have sort of implicitly admitted that the drug sentences were unnecessarily harsh and disproportionate, and that many incarcerated people could have lived through better alternatives than prison. The COVID-19 crisis is further revealing how, for the past 30 years, we have chosen to over-incarcerate at huge human and economic cost, because these young women and men could have been members of communities and families much needed at a time of a global health crisis that we're presently living through. Instead, they are sitting behind bars for acts and offenses of minimal seriousness. Finally, criminalization means a criminal record. And one should not underestimate that a criminal record can have a myriad of negative collateral consequences, affecting the person's employment, education, ability to contract a loan from a bank, housing, family life. In the United Kingdom, some research 2 years ago estimated that a criminal record for a cannabis offense could reduce lifetime earnings by up to 19%. And here again, I'd like to quote Kofi Annan, who said, quote, "A criminal record for a young person for a minor drug offense can be a far greater threat to their well-being than occasional drug use." And let me also add here that sentencing, of course, is based on the fact that the person would use an illegal substance. But the current distinction between legal and illegal substances is not really unequivocally based on pharmacological research. It is in large part based on historical and cultural precedents. So there are a number of inconsistencies in the current scheduling of drugs under the international drug control system, including, for example, keeping cannabis under Schedule 1. So it is important also to have in mind that the international community should now recognize the incoherence and inconsistencies in the international scheduling system and trigger a critical review of the current models of classification of drugs. Now, the other set of reasons why our Global Commission advocates for decriminalization of possession is about upholding the principles of human dignity, the right to privacy, and the rule of law. The right to privacy is a fundamental human right enshrined in most international human rights treaties, including the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The state is only justified in interfering in an individual's private life if the state can demonstrate that the interference is for a legitimate aim, such as preventing risk to others, is proportional and is necessary. Penalizing people who possess drugs for personal use and who cause no harm to others is neither proportional nor necessary and can never, we believe, be justified as an interference by the state. We believe that this interference undermines the right to privacy, personal autonomy, and human dignity. The consumption of drug is of itself an act which does not harm or put at risk the legal rights of others and should not be subject to interference. And we've seen in the last few years courts and Supreme Courts in a number of countries, in Chile, Spain, Colombia, South Africa, Argentina, having similarly ruled that the private use of drugs should not be subject to any state sanction. Our commission also questions whether criminalization of drug possession is not actually bringing the law into disrepute. The rule of law requires that citizens respect and comply with legal norms, even if they disagree. But such compliance is clearly absent when it concerns punitive laws controlling drug use, as evidenced by the hundreds of millions of people who use drugs every year across the world. Drug use, as you know, crosses gender, race, class, profession, with a significant portion of the society looking at it as a normal leisure activity. Remember that of 100 people using drugs globally, only 13% are dependent or addicted to substances. The vast majority of people who use drugs without significant harm. And obviously the risk of imprisonment or receiving a criminal record does little to stop them from committing this offense, one which essentially causes no harm to others. It's hard to think for us of another offense which causes no direct and immediate harm to others, but attracts such serious penalties while being so frequently breached across the globe. Beyond the widespread and persistent disregard for drug laws further questions the legitimacy of state actors such as the police. This is particularly the case when drug laws are overwhelmingly enforced against a narrow subsection of society. Often penalties fall most heavily on the poor and some marginalized from minority communities. Inequitable application of the law fundamentally undermines the basic principles of the rule of law, that in all society, everyone is equal in front of the law, and that application of the law should be consistent, fair, and impartial. So those inequitable applications of the law and over-arresting people based on the fact that they're marginalized severely weakens the relationship between the states, the society, and its citizens. In the last 2 years, let me also add that there's increasing support for decriminalization from many regional and global multilateral agencies, a call into questioning the rationale for pursuing harsh drug laws that, to me, culminated in the document published by the UN Secretary General Guterres, together with the 30 or so heads of agencies of the UN, again bringing support to decriminalization of drug use and possession. So, honorable members of Parliament and of the Commission, we, in summary, as a global commission, we advocate for a model of decriminalization that involves no punishment at all for people who use drugs. Our recommendations that were published 2 years ago state the following, and I'll read our recommendations. First, states must end all penalties, both criminal and civil, for drug possession for personal use and the cultivation of drugs for personal consumption. Millions of people around the world use drugs every day and do so without causing any harm to others. To criminalize people who use drugs is ineffective and harmful and undermines the principle of human dignity and the rule of law. Second, states must implement alternatives to punishment, such as diversion away from the criminal justice system, for all low-level, non-violent actors in the drug trade, such as those engaging in social supply, drug couriers, and user dealers. States must recognize that a number of people engage in these acts out of economic marginalization and implement alternatives to criminalizations that uphold international human rights standards. And finally, UN member states must remove the penalization of drug possession as a treaty obligation under the international drug control system. So these are, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Commission and dear Morgana, the views of the Commission, and I thank you all for your attention.